Okay, well, good morning or good afternoon to everybody. Thank you so much for joining our webinar today on site selection. So on behalf of our firm, Clark Street Associates, and our co-panelists, Cushman and Wakefield, the Detroit Regional Partnership, the South Carolina Department of Commerce, and American Clean Power, we'd like to thank you for joining. We'd like to also thank everybody. We got a lot of very good questions from you guys, which we're going to try and get to all of them. Um, so again, my name is Rex Sherry. I'm with Clark Street Associates, a senior member of our firm. I co-lead our site selection practice. Pierre, do you want to just put up the slide?
Yeah.
So just a little bit on us. We're a advisory boutique specializing in securing significant programs and non-dilutive capital from the federal and state governments overall. In our firm's history, we've got $3.5 billion of funding. And on the state side, from our site selection, we've been able to get 500 million in incentives secured over the last 18 months. Perhaps more interesting in that is that the projects we've worked on have brought 3,200 high-paying jobs and over 1.5 billion in capital expenditures to our state partners that we work with, such as Will Butler at the Detroit Regional Partnership and Teresa Powers at the state of South Carolina. Um, what we do is unique from a siting standpoint is that we're the only firm that integrates both state and federal, complementary federal incentives. And you know what that means for those of you contemplating manufacturing expansions is of the 500 million we brought for our siting projects, 200 million of that's federal, and most of that's cash. So that can make a big difference in helping to defray the cost of standing up a manufacturing facility. The clients we work with are in sectors we call the hard tech sectors. That includes semiconductors, electronics, computing, uh, and alternative energy, rare earth minerals, nuclear, clean technology, automotive, and advanced manufacturing. Um, I'd like to introduce my colleague and panelist, Piero Pold, to introduce himself briefly.
Hey everyone, thank you for that, Rex. My name's PR Rapold. I am the co-head of site selection here at Clark Street alongside Rex as well. Been with the firm for about 7 years now, based in San Francisco. Done about half a billion in total state incentives negotiated in the last couple of years as well. Pleasure to meet you all. Thank you for joining.
Okay, over to you, Teresa. Piero, you want to move the slide?
Hello, and thank you for having me today. It's a pleasure to be with you. I'm Teresa Powers. I am Deputy Director for our Global Business Development Division here at the South Carolina Department of Commerce. We are the lead economic development agency for the state, and our Secretary of Commerce is appointed by the governor. Our division, the one I'm affiliated with, GBD, we have a team of project managers that work in business recruitment and expansion. So working with those companies that are looking to explore setting up a location in South Carolina. And we also work with our existing industries that are expanding. Also part of that umbrella, we have 5 international offices across the globe, Europe, UK, Ireland, Taiwan, Japan, and Korea. Our Europe office is celebrating its 50th anniversary this year. And then we also focus on product development with regard to kind of sites and buildings and that real estate aspect. So we have a team working on that. Not only does Commerce, work to get companies to come to South Carolina, but once you're here, we also support you through additional services. Our business services team, we have existing industry folks who work with companies that are here in the state, as well as kind of programs in trade and recycling, supplier outreach, and also innovation and small business resources. So those are some of the services that are here once you come to South Carolina. You can see we've had some exceptional growth in the last few years. Last year alone, $8.2 billion in capital investment and over 5,500 jobs. We are known for being kind of in the automotive and aerospace sectors, but we also do a lot of agribusiness, Life sciences is our fastest growing industry sector. And you can see some of the logos there of the companies that have operations here. So thank you again look forward to joining you today.
Hey, good morning, good afternoon to everybody here. Thank you so much for having me on the panel, Rex and Piaru. My name is Matt Jarrett. I am with Cushman & Wakefield. Cushman & Wakefield is a very large global commercial real estate services firm. Many of you have probably seen our logos or signs all across the country or the world for that matter. But within that firm, I co-lead a team of about 6 people responsible for strategic acquisitions across North America. What that means is we specialize in projects that when companies need multi-market site selection or real estate evaluation and negotiations. So we partner with firms like Clark Street Associates and to help provide the ultimate solution for our clients. A lot of times that leads us into build-to-suits. We do a lot of network optimization for supply chains when a rollout needs to be completed to redo a supply chain or to stand up a new supply chain. And we're seeing a lot of that right now in terms of production and manufacturing. I'm very happy to be here and looking forward to diving into the questions. Thank you.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. My name is Will Butler. I'm the Vice President of Business Development at the Detroit Regional Partnership. We're the regional economic development agency for Southeast Michigan, so we represent the city of Detroit plus the surrounding 11 counties here in Michigan. It's about population about 5.5 million people. One of the major automotive centers of North America and the globe. Much like Teresa, right? We were founded, and our main mission is as the investment attraction arm for Metro Detroit. So my job is finding companies and technologies and spaces that matter to us, and then really handholding them through the process of setting up new footprint or new headcount here in Southeast Michigan. So services we provide, roughly bucketed in kind of understanding this region, regional data, finding real estate, connecting with service providers, potential incentives alongside other partners in the state, and then staffing and recruiting and talent support. We're a fairly new organization, so our first full year of operation was 2020, and we were set up with some aggressive goals for 2030, which we are really heading straight towards. So, in just a few years, for both direct and indirect job creation, we've done about 33,000 new jobs in that time, heading towards our goal of 50,000 new jobs by 2030. Again, direct and indirect jobs, and about $8.6 billion worth of capital investment and spin-off investment heading towards our goal of 10 billion by 2030, and supported a lot of companies, nameplate OEM and tier one automotive firms, but as well as startups, setting up their first office or kind of initial pilot production. So running the gamut from first offices all the way up to large 500,000 square foot production facilities, and just grateful to Clark Street and the fellow panelists for the opportunity today to speak with you all.
Excellent. And I think I'm last here. So first of all, thank you to Clark Street Associates for inviting me here. My name is MJ Shao. I'm the Vice President of Supply Chain and Manufacturing Policy for the American Clean Power Association. So the American Clean Power Association, we are the leading voice of today's multi-tech clean energy industry. We represent energy storage, wind, utility scale solar, clean hydrogen, and transmission companies. And we have about 500 members that represent over 70% of the clean energy deployment that's happening across the country. We're committed to meeting America's energy and national security goals by building our economy with fast-growing, low-cost, and reliable domestic power. And in particular, I'm excited today certainly to speak with the fellow panelists and answer some of these questions. But also, we just published a report, America Builds Power: The State of Clean Energy Manufacturing, where we found that clean energy manufacturers across the country, there are over 200 facilities building solar modules, wind turbines, wind towers, battery cells, battery modules, and other parts of the component supply chain. And that's creating 122,000 jobs across the country, producing $33 billion of annual economic output. And if all the announced facilities that have been planned come online by 2030, we'll see that grow to 575,000 jobs across the country and $164 billion of annual economic output. So we are a significant force within clean energy. Very excited to share, some of the personal stories we've had in manufacturing and also just what is happening with the clean energy manufacturing space overall. So thank you.
Okay, well, thanks everybody. So let's dive in. So I'm going to direct the first question to Will Butler. So Will, the new Trump administration's been very vocal in the reason for U.S. tariff policies to bring manufacturing back to the U.S. Can you describe what level of activity you're seeing from foreign companies looking to establish or increase their presence in the U.S., as well as if you're a foreign company, what are some of the considerations you need to think about in terms of coming to the U.S. that might be different than located in their home countries?
Yeah, thanks, Rex. I mean, I would say for the past few years, for those of us in economic development or in the development space, I think kind of coming out of COVID, once companies had the ability to feel sort of, stable about the ability to execute on a facility, to have personnel in person, interest has been really high. So we've seen a lot of projects and a lot of interest in FDI. I mean, clearly there's been policy shifts, right? Where I think in the previous administration you had some real carrots, pulling that way. And I know we're going to talk more about this. Now we're seeing, more of a stick as we talk about the potential tariffs. So interest has been incredibly high. We've closed a lot of projects. I will say, I think since, and I'm curious, what other panelists may think about this, since as we got closer to the election last fall, that interest has remained, but I think the need to pause and wait in companies sitting on the sidelines, we've seen that really rise. And I think that's kind of continued. I think for a while that was the election, waiting to see obviously who would win, what would shift in the policy world. And now I think as tariffs are being brought online, a lot of companies are waiting to see sort of a normalization or a stabilization. They want to see sort of where we end up sitting in all these changes before they really look at executing. So I think we're sort of in this hiatus status quo sort of situation where interest remains. I mean, the U.S. market, its fundamentals remain appealing no matter what, I think. And there's drivers here, but I think they're waiting for companies, especially foreign companies, are waiting for some policy stability. And I think that the last thing I'll just say, just in terms of the usual tips and tricks that we're telling foreign companies as they look at the U.S. market, one of the first things that we are addressing with companies is that, we might be one country, but as you look at 50 different states, it's better probably approached as 50 different countries, right? Regulatory environments, rules, policies are dramatically different as you look across the United States. We do a lot of education on benefits, right? Healthcare benefits is always a big obstacle, I think, especially for European firms who might be coming to the United States. And then also a lot of handholding around ingratiating into a community, becoming an employer of choice, how you build that brand, right? You might be big in your home country, but coming to a brand new market and a brand new place, it takes time to really build that brand and become locally well known. So, two different kind of pathways there, but that's what we're seeing from companies and what we're telling companies on how they approach the U.S. market.
And Teresa, is your experience similar or different?
I would echo a lot of Will's comments. I think we always, coming out of COVID, we've seen record number of investment coming into the state. And so for the past 3 years or so, the interest has been amazing, large investments. We also always see historically, we always see kind of a dip in an election year because part of that is just that uncertainty. And you can see it in the numbers going back to like 2020, where you see it softening in an election year. As soon as the election's over, you see it rebound and people get back to business as normal. It doesn't matter which administration won. It just kind of, people just want that certainty. This year, I agree, it has been a little bit different. Certainly, we've seen it soften a little bit since the election. And then with tariffs coming in, we haven't seen kind of that rebound because of that uncertainty in policy. And while we're seeing a lot of interest and interest remains high, certainty when you're talking about investing hundreds of millions of dollars or billions, you really want that certainty when you make that decision. So we're seeing a little bit of a pause there as people try to figure out this new environment and the swings, as we're seeing swings, not only week to week, but day to day sometimes, they have got to work through that and understand these policies. I think once we get some settling and kind of eliminate some of that risk that companies may see coming with the tariff situation, we will get back a little bit more to business as usual and see projects, continuing to make announcements and make commitments. South Carolina, from a foreign direct investment perspective, we have always been a leader in that field. We see a lot of investment. Germany and Japan have historically made significant investments in our state. Certainly Korea is becoming more and more of a player in the, not only in South Carolina, but in other states around the country. So we help work with those. You do see, I guess, in working with foreign companies, if they don't have a presence in the United States, you do have to do some holding and educating them on kind of doing business in the US, things that may come into play if they don't have operations here at all, things like, how do you structure your company? Is it a C corporation or an LLC? What are you going to do with your revenues? Are you going to pull them out of the country or are you going to leave them here? And so those are some of the things that maybe we don't deal with at Commerce directly, but can bring those players, attorneys and accountants who can help them understand those implications. And that's very important kind of on that front end, setting up your business correctly so that you can maximize, the tax impact, minimize the tax impact and maximize your revenue here. But also there are things, we help them kind of from start to finish, trying to identify communities and places that will work for them, and help them understand the environment. As you move through that process, they may start looking at a state for a lot of reasons. Maybe it's the tax environment, regulatory environment, things of that nature. But as you work through that process and start kind of narrowing where you want to locate, certainly that local community plays a bigger and bigger role, because at the end of the day, companies locate in communities, and that's going to be their first line of interaction as they are setting up their operation and, working in that community and gathering that labor force. So the state still plays a role, and we are always here, but at the local community, that's where you are really setting up your shop.
That's great. Thank you. So maybe one over to MJ. For those that didn't know, MJ's background prior to the role that he has in American Clean Power, he actually led a site selection project for the largest solar company in the world. So maybe MJ, you could describe the project and you could talk about what you experienced, versus what you thought heading into the process, and what was the primary reason you ended up picking the state that you did?
Absolutely. And before I jump into that, just wanted to add on to what Teresa and Will were saying. Certainly there's tariffs that are impacting folks' decision making, but also right now tax policy that's impacting decisions as well. So it's really a 1-2 punch in terms of folks trying to see what our federal government's going to do. There's probably no surprises here in that we see Congress's actions this week as essentially amounting to a structural retreat from what we see as a strategic sector in clean energy that will actually weaken the American base. We can get a manufacturing base. Can get into that a little bit more later, but just jumping into Rex's question here. So before I joined American Clean Power and my background, I was head of North American strategy for one of the globally leading solar technology companies. And, we had a lot of interest in bringing manufacturing to the U.S., certainly with, the focus on COVID supply chains. And also, when the previous Congress passed tax credits to help incentivize the buildup of clean energy manufacturing in the U.S., that was attractive as well. We established a relationship with one of our largest customers in Invenergy, one of the largest independent power producers in the country. And in that development, we really kind of focused how we could jointly set up, again, U.S. solar module manufacturing with a vision to, I think as Teresa may have mentioned, kind of bringing more than just, assembly and really looking at how to vertically integrate, the technology and manufacturing to the U.S. So, and it was exciting for the company because it was going to be the company's first manufacturing facility outside of Asia as well. So a lot of things to work through in terms of cultural differences, a lot of things to work through in terms of understanding, new regulations, 50 different states, of course, pretty overwhelming in terms of, again, a company that had a very significant understanding of manufacturing and a large manufacturing base, but having to translate that to what it takes to be successful in the US. So we ultimately needed, just kind of outlining what this looked like, about 1 million square feet of, didn't have to have necessarily any specialized infrastructure, but we would have to build that out. I think one of the hardest things at the time was finding a site that we could quickly bring power to site. A lot of facilities we had seen at the time were made more for distribution warehouses, and we need about 15 megawatts of power. We need about 1,000 skilled workers for an industry that basically where there were not that many facilities in the US that were in existence. And, we were also bringing new technology to the space as well, not to mention the usual things in terms of access to logistics, and all the usual services that are required. So given all this, we actually needed a lot of help. We were able to set up with Clark Street Associates, I think somewhere in September of 2021. And, it was a series of kind of how to take a grand 50 state and thousands of communities and try to, instead of boil the ocean, try to start to narrow down to states that we could target. So it started out with kind of a simple ranking of states based off some of the things that we needed. Of course, low cost power, access to these logistics and services that were unique to the manufacturing facility that we needed, skilled labor, cost of construction, access to the market. Certainly, we didn't want to set these things up and then ship them halfway across the country. We wanted to be close to where our customer base and where we saw the market to move, and work with Clark Street to start to identify and narrow down states. So we ranked, started with 27, and then that ranking allowed us to hone in probably around 8 states, I think. And then after kind of looking through those a little bit more, tweaking some criteria, we were finally able to really land on 5 states, some in the Southwest, some in the Southeast, and some in the Midwest as well. And then that was, I think, the transition to something that was I think part of the most exciting part of the process, which is to actually go and talk to the states, talk to folks, look at sites on the ground, work with folks like Teresa, like Will, to really start to contemplate what the different advantages that each of these different locations could bring. And certainly there were a lot of things that think about when you're sitting in front of a computer, but when you're actually there on site, it looks very different. And so some of the sites that we were looking at, the constraints were just site related, couldn't bring power quickly enough to it, or maybe there were some of the blueprints for the site that didn't show certain things, like I think one had drainage and grading issues. So you start to like narrow things down. But I think one of the most important pieces of it was really getting to know the state itself. And certainly everybody loves it when a state writes a big check to you, and that is certainly a part of the process. But I think what really differentiated the state that we ultimately chose, which was Ohio, was that what was the help and what were the resources that they could help, especially a foreign company, to start to integrate more with the community and really draw upon those local resources. So those state and local officials, they made a huge impact in terms of, again, not just sharing about, what are the taxes or what are the, economic incentives, but bringing into the meetings, like, here are the workforce agencies, here are the community colleges, here's how they set up workforce training, here are the things that we can do in terms of helping make sure that when that site goes online, we can bring that skilled workforce and start working efficiently right away. And also just the commitment that they're able to show in terms of connecting us with local partners, connecting us with local service providers that we needed to, of course, build out the infrastructure and start setting up the logistics network that we needed. So, ultimately there were a lot of states, a lot of locations that we were looking at, but what ultimately did turn the tide for us is kind of that, both the direct incentives, but especially some of the indirect incentives that were related. And then, of course, the site that was ready to go and allowed us to move quickly. So, that worked a lot with Clark Street Associates. They were hand in hand with us and our partner the entire way. They helped a lot with, just having that network of, state officials that were in their network already, and just made the process a lot easier, especially, again, a company that was very familiar with how to do the technical pieces of the manufacturing, but was starting to learn how to actually localize that in the US for the first time.
That's great. Thanks, MJ. Maybe Matt, over to you. Can you talk about what role does the commercial real estate firm play in the overall siting process, and perhaps more importantly, when's the right time to bring a firm like yours into the process, knowing that, as MJ just described, these processes can take many months.
Yeah, that's a great question. The simple answer is to bring us in as early as possible, even if it's only in an advisory role and we're not actually going out to market yet, because there's a lot of inherent knowledge already in our toolkit and in our tool belt that we can provide and give you to help frame your concept of your project. We always like to call this concept to keys. So as soon as you have a concept for a need and a business need that requires real estate, let's start talking about it and open up that line of communication. Our role really is we're your primary conduit, especially as a brokerage firm, a primary conduit to the market insights that you need, from purchase prices to rental rates to trends that we're seeing. What's the outlook over the next 18, 24 months? Helping you figure out the different ways to fund your real estate decisions. There's capital planning involved with that. There are many different ways to fund your buildings. Also identifying sites in buildings, getting a taste for what's out there. If you want to know, we help a lot of companies that say, I just kind of need to know very early, is it even possible to go to these 2 or 3 states and to even get an existing building? Or am I going to have to build one? We can quickly find that out. And then finally, negotiating those real estate contracts, whether they're owned, their development agreements, their build-to-suit agreements, their regular lease agreements, all kinds of agreements. We are doing those every day, and we help you do that. Probably the best example of this is actually a tie into MJ's project. We didn't know it at the time, but we worked on the same project. We later figured that out. Our team handled the real estate portion of that project, while MJ and Clark Street handled a lot of the data and state level negotiations. And our intermediary was the client. So Invenergy and the JV partnership that Invenergy had called Longy, and that was a really interesting process. I remember the 8 states that MJ talked about, and when we got to that point, our role was to go scour those states to find the sites and buildings that could fit their criteria and bring them back to them. And we would help them evaluate them from a qualitative and quantitative perspective. Eventually, we negotiated the final deal terms to help them buy their building. And we had to use our relationship kind of horsepower to even get the ability to buy it, which is what Invenergy wanted to do. This type of building was built speculatively from an investment fund that had the idea to lease it and then sell it as an investment product, which is the normal course of a real estate transaction. When an occupier shows up like Invenergy and says, I actually want to buy your building, sometimes that is a little difficult to make happen because the developer who built it might not get their full return unless it's negotiated properly. Well, we helped navigate that process using our relationships to do that. But it was also interesting in siting it and finding it. Speed, and I know MJ remembers this, speed was very important to the project. They are literally having to beat other competitors to the table. And it's a business problem. It's not just a real estate problem. So we're helping them with a business problem. So we looked at sites that were greenfield, but we also looked at existing buildings. And we were able to find that existing building in Ohio that was across the street from the power capability and could pull it over. For those of you who, may not know, a typical warehouse building that's just built empty, waiting for a tenant, has only 1 to 2 megawatts of power, if that. It's very slim. It's not made for a manufacturer. So to find an existing building where you can quickly pull power in at the 10 to 15 megawatt level was an incredible find, and it ended up becoming a successful project for Invenergy and MJ's team.
Okay, thanks. Piero, maybe you could talk a little bit about, for companies that aren't large multinational corporations that don't have people that have done this before, what advice would you give them before they begin their site selection journey? And, what are some of the steps you think that matter the most?
Yeah, I think what's really critical for companies of a smaller size, because you compare that to large ones which have dedicated teams to this. And ultimately, it's a much more straightforward process with them. But for smaller companies, I think it's really identifying a date that you need to be commencing operations from, because I mention that as we see the mistake with a fair amount of companies where they go and say, well, I hope we can get this going by, whenever. And ultimately, it lacks a certain amount of accountability, if you will, to get this site up to speed, because especially too as a negotiating chip when or using leverage in this case, really, if you can come to a state or a community and say, hey, we need to have this site up by X date, suddenly they're vested in this to make sure that you have what you need at the site in time, whether it's having the building up, whether it's moving soil, whether it's having utilities to the site itself. I think one, that's a critical area, and two, is also having a concrete scope of the project as well. I think oftentimes companies don't necessarily take the time to think through how big is this facility going to be from a CapEx standpoint? What is our, sure, let's say we want 200 jobs, but what do those jobs actually entail? And understanding that breakdown between what's going to be our R&D roles, what's going to be our manufacturing roles. Because, for example, a lot of states will pay you extra for, or excuse me, incentivize for what you could call an R&D job. And that's ultimately where a lot of value, I think, is lost for certain companies too. And I think, again, I'll reemphasize that having your team ready, a point man internally, and your external counsel, whether it's a site selector, a real estate team, real estate counsel specifically, and also an established team with the state or the local partners is ultimately going to be your most important step to getting your project on the rails the right way.
Okay. Maybe to build up on the comment that Matt and MJ made about the importance of power. Today, we're in an environment where it's data center utopia, where we talk about all AI and all the power that's going to be needed, and we hear statistics such as by 2027, 40% of the data centers won't have enough power. Maybe we could hear from Teresa first and then Will. What is the power situation like in your state right now? And for companies that aspire to come to your state, how do they best work with the state to figure out power needs and so on? Maybe you could start that one off, Teresa.
Absolutely. And you are correct. I think data centers have definitely put a spotlight on power usage and power needs for companies locating. But I will say, it's not just data centers. I think all the projects we are seeing, especially these larger ones, are having more and more of a power need. So what, used to be maybe 5 megawatts was a huge load, a decade ago. It's now, a lot of manufacturers as well as data centers are having much larger utility needs. And that really factors in the, I guess, in the site selection process as we are getting these requests for projects and consultants are bringing us these projects, and they have large power loads. One of our first steps, if it's a large power need, we're going to the power companies first in a lot of cases to have that discussion, because if you don't have the power, the site, you may have the land, you may have other infrastructure, you may have labor, but if you can't get the power there on the companies, the amount and on the timeline they need it, a lot of cases that's going to knock you out of the competition for this project. In South Carolina, this has certainly been on our radar with us. Increased emphasis in the last couple of years. Our legislature has been having conversations, bringing together not only government contacts, but the power companies and other private and public interests to kind of understand where we stand with power and what we need to be doing to make smart decisions for the future. You are seeing part of that. We did have some legislation come out in this last session where they have made it a little bit easier for power companies to bring on new generation. So, and then we actually have 2 projects kind of underway in South Carolina. One is where a decommissioned coal generation facility, we are going to convert that to a natural gas facility. So that's one where we're, kind of bringing on some new generation, and that will help, with the already being a power generation site. It helps kind of shorten some of those timelines. We also have, in South Carolina, we do have a lot of nuclear power generation. So over 50% of our portfolio is in nuclear. And we have a nuclear facility that was adding new generation, 2 new reactors that kind of that project was abandoned a few years back. Now we have actually issued an RFP out there to see the interest in companies to bring that, to kind of take over that project and bring those, new generation online from the nuclear standpoint. So we are excited about that. But the power companies, we're in a good situation now, but I think, like I said, it is about timelines. Those are certainly, from the power standpoint, getting longer, not only just because getting the power to the site, but transformers, that supply chain that they are dealing with is really, it used to be 18 months, 2 years. Now, that's getting a lot longer just to get the supplies they need to get the power there. So, but they are an ongoing partner. We're in good shape, but it's definitely on the radar, and we're continuing to monitor, our situation with power.
Appreciate that. Will, what's the environment like in Michigan?
Yeah. I got lots of thoughts on this. I mentioned I mentioned projects being on the sidelines. Oh, everyone's kind of pausing, waiting for certainty. That could not be further from the truth when it comes to data centers right now. I mean, I think for a lot of us that are in the development space or economic development, right? I mean, they're out there hunting aggressively and fast now, right? And it's because of obviously you have the growth of AI. I mean, these things where, I heard someone liken to, like now you got an Amazon distribution facility, right? Every few miles, you're probably going to have a data center every few miles if we're really going to accommodate what we need to do in computing and AI. And I feel for utilities. It's weird to feel sympathy for, some of these Fortune 500, utility companies. But you had the electrification of everything, in automotive, and to a lot of points being made, our grid, our buildings were built out for sort of like a megawatt, 2 megawatt kind of distribution or minor manufacturing. And then all of a sudden you had electrification and demands got massive, right? And now you have this data center boom coming. And so, demand on the utility companies is still really high, and we don't have the grid for that, and we've made it difficult to build. I'm sure MJ could talk a lot about this. We've made it difficult to build new generation, right, for a whole host of reasons. Uh, we're seeing this in Michigan. Obviously, we were originally really a tertiary market for data centers, right? And then I think a few things. One, the AI boom, but two, we passed a sales and use tax exemption here in Michigan for data centers, and it kind of unleashed the floodgates. I'd say in our situation, I think with our utilities, we have two main utilities. DT Energy and Consumers Energy are taking a cautious approach. And I sort of have a respect for that because I think they've watched other states and other utilities overextend themselves and get ahead of their skis a little bit, where they've committed power early and upfront, but then really lose the ability. They have no more generation, right? They're tapped out. So I think our utilities recognize that, saw that in some other markets that were maybe more primary in the data center space, and are now realizing we need to be very cautious and coordinated about this so that we're not, of course they're encouraging economic development, but they're not ruining their entire system for residents and other businesses currently operating. So that's what we're seeing. I am excited, similar to Teresa. We have a nuclear power plant that is going to be restarted in Michigan. The Palisades plant that should bring 800 megawatts, I think, back online in terms of generation here in Michigan. And I know the owner and the kind of key contractor on that are also talking about some SMRs or SNRs for small nuclear reactors alongside that. And I think that's one of the things that's really interesting as we talk about this data center boom. You're going to see a lot of new creative necessity is the mother of invention, a lot of new creativity about power generation on site. So I think that can be really exciting. The last thing I will just say for companies previously, I think the point that the companies had to leverage for utilities, even against all the constraints for utilities, supply chain issues, getting things up and running, companies had, I think, the ability to say, okay, we're going to go to another location, right? We're going to go somewhere else now because you can't meet our timeline. I have to be honest, just for anyone who's in a site selection, I think that's flipping, right? Because I think power companies are saying we got a lot of people looking for power and they're looking for power everywhere. I think you as the company need to be like, it's difficult because you have real timelines as well. But end users need to be more cognizant upfront and build in that timeline, because I think that's a national issue, not a local issue. And I think you're gonna see a lot of utilities giving you the same answers about the 3+ year timeline they need to get equipment and get you, generated on site and get you energized.
Okay, maybe MJ, you could just, add in the mix on this one because your companies can be added sources of power for the grid. How do you see your companies and your coalition playing a role in bringing more capacity online? And, over what time frame might we expect to see meaningful contributions from your groups of companies?
Yeah, that's a great point, Rex. We're on both sides of the equation, actually. So certainly with the project deployments of solar, wind, battery storage, certainly being part of that generation mix and already a significant contribution to the US's electricity mix. But also on the manufacturing side and building these components, also, part of the power demand that Will and Teresa just talked about. I think what we are seeing right now is that, clean energy, solar, wind, battery storage is one of the fastest generations to market, forms of generations to market. Just to maybe take a step back, we put out a study earlier this year that we expect anywhere between 35 to 50% electricity growth in the next 15 years, which is incredible if you think about sort of a flat load growth over the previous 10 to 20 years. So, we're going to need a lot of demand, all for, AI data centers, manufacturing, of course. And with solar, wind, and batteries, you can bring these projects online on very quick timelines. With certainly permitting and interconnection can cause some delays, but with the supply chains that exist right now for solar, wind, we're talking about 1-2 years, whereas for supply chains for maybe some other forms of generation, maybe taking a little bit longer. I will echo, Teresa's point that things like transformers are a bottleneck for everyone. Those are things that are incredibly important to, have in mind, right? As to, you are starting to select a site, because those are, again, we're starting to see 2-3 year timelines for, especially for larger power transformers. But again, I think what Teresa and Will have said, we're starting to see this boom, this demand everywhere. But again, with clean energy, I think our companies are contributing not only to, your standard generation on the grid, but certainly folks that are looking at more creative solutions, maybe some kind of behind the meter configurations that can also support and also combine with other forms of generation, right? It's not just, necessarily just need solar or wind. We combine with natural gas, combine with other existing forms of generation on the grid to have that right diversity of energy that's appropriate for the site and the local grid.
Thank you. So maybe Matt, over to you. With high interest rates, global economic uncertainty, and turbulent financial markets, two questions. One, what impact is that having on commercial real estate? And then, what is that? A lot of the companies, it's sort of barbells. You have big mature companies, established companies, and you also have companies on the emerging side, like a lot of the companies that MJ's group might be putting out. What does it look like for those types of companies?
Yeah, so starting with the interest rate situation. So we are seeing over the last 3 years in particular, the cost of money has risen across all sectors of business, and real estate is no exception. Over the past 15 years, we've had relatively and artificially low interest rates, and that kind of became normal in a lot of people's minds. And really, where the interest rates are now are actually more reflective of long time historical averages. They just don't feel normal, emotionally and mentally, and for a lot of our pro formas, because we got so used to such low interest rates. I mean, I'll never see the 2.5% rate on my house that I got, 5 years ago ever again. I never want to let go of that loan. Same thing on the commercial side. So when we look at this, what it's done is it's actually tightened the financing market. In fact, we've had a couple of significant hiccups over the last 18 months where there were months where the debt markets in real estate just ground to a halt for a few weeks because of iterative changes in policy, rising interest rates, and everybody just stepping back, going, I don't even want to buy a building right now because I can't forecast what the value of my building will be even 12 months from now, let alone 6. So that made some of the projects you see out there not financeable. If you have investment grade credit, that can be overcome. Investment grade credit pretty much trumps everything. And those deals could get done and still are getting done. We are seeing the debt markets loosen and open back up over the last 12 months or so. It is still hard for emerging companies who don't have credit yet. And we work with both. So we work with BMWs and Mercedes of the world, and we work with startups of the world. As an example, we just did one together with Clark Street that's in the clean energy space, and they're cash flow positive, but they're not big yet. They don't have a track record. They're not public. Frankly, the value of the building is almost the value of their entire business combined. So those situations, we have to look at existing buildings that have been built spec in core markets. There's a lot of reasons behind that, but the primary reason is location. If something were to happen to the tenant, the landlord needs to know that if the tenant were to vacate, they could easily release it because it's in a core market. And it usually needs to be a building that a developer has already built at risk without a tenant, and they want somebody to come in and pay. They'll be more willing to do that in that situation than to go build-to-suit for a tenant that doesn't have good credit, and they're building a building they otherwise would not have built. So it's two different risk profiles. They both have to be analyzed. We also use credit enhancements in situations where a tenant doesn't have good credit. That could be a guarantee from a backer who does have good credit. It could be larger security deposits or letters of credits from banks. And then lastly, there's the equivalent of VC cash. So if you have a startup that's operating off of venture capital, which is very expensive, they may not be able to find a building that they can do using the other items we just talked about. Maybe they have to be somewhere that's not a core market, and they can't put up a letter of credit. So they go buy a building, and we coach them through that early on, analyzing their credit profile, saying, look, you're going to have a hard time going down the lease route or doing a lease build-to-suit. You really need to be prepared to own this building for a few years. Later, you could sell it. Once your credit rises, you can trade off that credit later and do a sale leaseback. This goes back to my comment earlier about having a good advisor on board who can help you through capital planning of how do I fund these real estate decisions. It really varies across the situation, the location, the credit profile. Last thing I'll say on that is real estate investors are not VC investors. They have two completely different mindsets. We see companies try to pitch their businesses to real estate investors, and it's like banging their heads against a wall. They have very, very different goals. If they wanted to put their money in venture capital and earn those high returns and do that kind of risk, they would have done it, but they did it in real estate instead. So we help companies walk through that, teach them the ropes, help them navigate. Hopefully that answers your question, Rex.
Yeah, and just to build on what Matt said, it's real estate investing and VC investing are almost the inverse.
Yes.
VC investing, you want high growth. Real estate investing wants low growth and inconsistency.
Right.
VCs are willing to fund losses so it can get to be bigger and get to cash flow real estate investors want cash flow out of the gate. So anyway, just keep that in mind as you pitch. And again, it's all the importance of why you need somebody like Matt on your team who can help you navigate, because it's not as simple as you give the VC pitch to a real estate company. Okay. Just from a time check standpoint, I know for some of the webinar had indicated an hour. We've got the ability to go 15 minutes longer because I know we have a lot of questions. So we'll stretch this to 10:15 Pacific. If you can stay on, great, because we want to get to some of your questions. If you can't, we certainly understand. I'm going to go over to Will and Teresa. We see you guys get a lot of press for the big projects, the big battery project or the big automotive project or the big industrial project. But, can you talk about what project might be too, when might a project be too small for your state? And are there special programs you offer towards emerging companies, or those companies you want to attract? So if you guys can speak to that, please. You first, Will.
Yeah, sure thing. No, I mean, I mentioned this in the intro. I think one of the things that we pride ourselves on is, right, from for the foreign companies, sometimes it's like the one person, two-person sales office, right, to the large production facilities. We definitely are highly supportive and heavily supportive of emerging companies and startups. And part of the reason is I think Michigan, uh, and not alone in this, other states are similar kind of positions where we need to, as an economy, we need to retain and grow the traditional manufacturing and automotive base that we have. That is a huge amount of our labor force is employed there, right? They're large nameplate employers. That's a critical part of our economy. But we're in this point where we're making this jump to probably a more innovation focused economy here in Michigan. Detroit was a couple of years ago was ranked the number one emerging startup ecosystem in the world, right? So a few years ago we had we had the fastest growth rate in terms of venture capital here in Michigan. So we're seeing this change, and so the ability to both like retain and grow our existing large scale manufacturing and grow into this space is something that we're always dealing with on a economic development side, on a policy side, and incentive toolbox side. So a few things, not to get too granular into Michigan's programming, but our main incentive program is a cash grant that scales down to, about 25 new jobs over a 3 to 5 year period, which doesn't fit every company, but can be kind of scaled and flexed for large projects as well as smaller projects, initial offices. We just passed a new innovation fund, which, kind of a fund to fund program, but really is going to accelerate, I think, a lot of investment of both startups coming out of our universities, but also the startup attraction piece. Michigan, I'll admit, was a laggard. We got rid of our R&D tax credit, not that, years ago. We brought that back, I think, recognizing this change. The other thing that I think Michigan has done well that I give a lot of credit to is we set aside some cash funding for pilots and deployments, recognizing that for a lot of emerging companies, this first step may not be a large facility, right? It may not be massive headcount, but it's the ability to pilot a technology and to deploy alongside Michigan partners. And so that's something that there has been funding set aside through and a full structure to invest in that. And we've also been really lucky, to have you got kind of a whole new growth rate of innovation hubs happening here in Michigan. New Lab, which, some people may know, they're a hard tech accelerator based out of New York, did a big expansion here, a 300,000 square foot facility to support companies just like this. And you got a few others. So, I would say absolutely is the answer to your question, Rex. And there's a strong amount of programming, spaces, and dollars to support them.
Okay. Teresa, you want to comment from a South Carolina perspective?
Certainly. And so, yes, as we're, a manufacturing state, but these innovation companies are definitely getting more and more attention and becoming more of a high profile for us, and how to attract them, how to land them, how to grow them. And so, we can work with as little as 10 jobs, and in some cases as little as $50,000 of investment. It's so some of that is not too small for us. But on those innovation spaces, we do, and I mentioned kind of in my opening, our business services team, which does have an innovation component to that. So they are keeping kind of their finger on the pulse of the kind of the innovation, the VC community around the state, and we rely on them to help kind of integrate these type of companies and connect them with our partners around the state to find those resources that can help them grow. We have the South Carolina Research Authority, so they can come in and help work with these companies. They have landing space for them and can help them grow. We can help kind of connect them with those VC funds, where if they need funding, we can kind of head them in the right direction for those funds. But yeah, we're seeing it is definitely more and more of a bigger piece of what we are focused on and what we are looking to grow in our state. We have a R&D credit similar to, what Will was talking about. So we do that aspect of it. We're looking for those kind of higher paying, they may be small in numbers, but the higher paying jobs that are going to be more technically oriented and grow these aspects in our state, really take a priority role for us at this time.
Okay.
Rex, if I may add to this as well, I mean, I think it's really exciting what Will and Teresa are saying about, looking at innovation. And I think there's actually a nexus between manufacturing and innovation as well. There's a Department of Defense estimate that about 70% of all R&D spending is from the manufacturing sector. So having that flexibility to look at innovation, but especially not looking necessarily as a distinct thing that is a separate, part of the economy, there is so much link. And as you bring manufacturing and support manufacturing in the state or in the community, you start to bring those highly technical, highly skilled roles in. Those people have their own ideas and start their own thing, or even within the apparatus of the organization that they're with, start to bring additional partners, additional folks in the supply chain, and more innovative partners to the space as well. So we like to think of it as an ecosystem and not necessarily two distinct places within the economy.
Appreciate that. Thank you. Piero, maybe over to you. We've heard some use cases MJ described in his case, what attracted them. Can you comment on, based on your experience in citing projects, is it as simple as the winning state is the one that puts that puts the most dollars on the table, and that's why companies choose to go to that state? What's your experience, and can you comment on, if it's not the case, what are some of the factors that you see really move the needle and are important to companies as they pick a state and a site?
Yeah, so I think definitely the biggest difference recently in my experience is that been speed matters really more than ever. States that can move quickly and are kind of moving on a single team and united are winning. So let's say even if their base incentive package isn't perhaps the largest, companies are really putting a premium on states on what they feel will be their partner going forward, in that this isn't just a single real estate transaction, but this is a growth investment into the state. A lot of the times, I think companies have the, I guess, short observation that they think once they come to the state, it's hands off from the state. See you guys later. I think both Michigan and South Carolina, as easy examples here, do an outstanding job with what you can call post-transaction support through their workforce development and training curricula. This is stuff where you can actively develop, say, a new virtual training manual for standing up a new facility, help foreign companies help their employees acclimate culturally. These are all really, really small things that I think in a zero interest rate environment, people weren't necessarily that in tune to. But I think as budgets now get tighter and tighter and projects go under further scrutiny, companies really need to make sure that their ducks are in a row once it comes to getting their facilities up to scale, because ultimately without that, a completed real estate transaction is far from indicating the long-term success of a facility, which is the very thing that states and locales are incentivizing when it comes to these projects.
And I suspect Will and Teresa might want to weigh in. I would only add for some projects, it's infrastructure. If you're shipping something that's heavy, maybe it's access to a port or it's access to rail. Certainly power, as we've heard, is paramount. Sometimes it can be adequacy of wastewater. In certain districts, as we found in another state, they just didn't have any more. So if you wanted to expand a semiconductor plant, you couldn't. For some companies that are more involved in chemicals in their manufacturing process, they enter a category called high air emitter. I'm sure different states have different terms for it, but that can lead to extended permitting. So there are a myriad of considerations, each of which are different. It could also be, sometimes supporting infrastructure is really important. Do you have the supply chain and other things you're going to need? Is feedstock important? So we tend to find incentives are certainly very important, but we tend to find in our experience that incentives are not the number one criteria, as PR has explained, and I think Will and Teresa have done a good job in why companies choose to go with a particular state. Maybe over to you, MJ. So, MJ, maybe you could comment on, you made the comment about, and it's no secret that there's less funding that's going to be available for the Trump administration for the classic clean tech company. Now, we are seeing that there are different flavors of that if you're in the fusion or fission, we think there's going to be more money. If you're in critical minerals, there's going to be more money. If you're doing semiconductors or things that are important to defense, there's going to be more money. If you're in artificial intelligence, there's going to be more money. But the classic flavors of clean tech look like they're going to get less money. So two questions. One, do your members have experience in looking at going across the border to Canada? And two, is that something you're finding that your companies are increasingly looking like, based on the fact that Canada, their appetite at the federal level has not diminished for providing funding for clean tech companies?
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe just to start off with, I think one of the great challenges right now for the clean energy industry is that it's being viewed as a partisan industry, right? Which couldn't be further for the truth. When we see investments from clean energy, approximately 80% of them are actually in more rural Republican districts. We see 73% of the manufacturing facilities set up in states that voted for the president in the 2024 election. And I think one of the challenges that we have right now is that many of the federal energy tax credits that were passed to support clean energy were done so in a partisan vehicle. But again, the ideas, the policy itself is actually quite bipartisan. So I think one of the things we continue to have to do is to show just how the investments, how clean energy is going to support, again, policies that make the American economy stronger overall. I think, certainly we're very disappointed with what Congress, or with specifically the House, has voted on this morning. But we continue to think that rational, cooler heads will prevail, and we'll continue to get this fixed, and we'll continue to invest in clean energy in the U.S. And so with that view, I think our members are still very committed to onshoring manufacturing for the clean energy supply chain. Even in the past 5-6 months, we've continued to see announcements. We continue to see manufacturers start operations, and certainly there are always cancellations in any industry. That can be due to macroeconomic factors, can due to specific factors with that company or facility. But on the whole, we're seeing billions of dollars in terms of American manufacturing actually come online, and more being announced. So I think the commitment remains. Certainly, everyone needs to look at how to structure their business, especially when we do have global supply chains. We are As with any other sector, as with the economy as a whole, folks are going to source the combination of domestic components as well as components made abroad, whether that's US, Canada, Europe, Asia. I think as Will and Teresa pointed out very early in this discussion, that's going to depend a lot on how, the tariff situation plays out. So again, I think as with everything, things have to make commercial sense. There needs to be business certainty. There needs to be a commitment from the federal government, and there needs to be, just that long-term visibility of what the market and what the supports are going to look like. And certainly I know, Teresa and Will, they're doing a lot at their state to, do everything in their control. But the federal government, of course, plays a big role. So I just want to say that I don't necessarily think that our members are just saying, "Hey, we're going to give up on the U.S. We're going to flee to other markets." I think there is a deep commitment to building in the U.S. But again, we have to, the federal policy has to align even with what the states are doing to support those manufacturers and building in the U.S.
Okay, thank you. We get time for one more, and I'm going to put it to both Matt and Will and Teresa. So, Matt, you talked about a more difficult environment, so maybe you could sort of bookend us in terms of how long should people budget from a time frame standpoint for what's reasonable to, execute a commercial real estate transaction. And then secondly, what's the right way to do that? Do you go all the way till you've got your state incentives and it's been approved, or do you try and run that in parallel? Maybe you could speak to those two. And then I'd go over to Will and Teresa to comment on, how long are you seeing in your experience it taking for companies to pick a site, get their deal done and get it all, approved in your states. So over to you first, Matt.
Absolutely. Those are two great questions. I'm going to answer the second one first. So we recommend doing this in parallel. In fact, the methodology that we use when we are in a true site selection project and we're working with Clark Street or another partner or whoever it might be, when there are multiple factors at play from a workforce, from infrastructure and utilities, taxation and incentives, and the real estate piece, those are all layers that really need to be analyzed almost like a cake or a lasagna analysis. They all play a role. There was a great conversation a minute ago about how the biggest dollar amount on the bottom of an incentives offer doesn't necessarily win the deal. You've got to have the right stuff underneath the surface there, from labor to location to real estate. So you don't want to wait till the end to say, okay, now let's negotiate on this site. It might not be viable, or there's a whole piece of data missing to wait till the end. So we don't recommend doing that. We recommend integrating it. And then in terms of time, for projects like these that we've been talking about that have these multiple layers and service providers, they're typically a minimum of 6 months up to 10. It kind of depends on how fast the company can move, how complex it is. 8 is a good average, and that's not stopping. That's without any pauses in the project. Your first half of that is usually location-based decision making. Your second half of that is usually negotiating on your top 1 or 2 locations, and you have discrete sites that you're looking at. So hopefully that helps answer your questions.
It does. Thank you. Maybe, Will, you could take this one first, and then Teresa. But what are you, when companies come to your state and to find a site, do all the work, get it all the way through the legislature. How are those processes? What does that timeline look like? Is it compressing, extending in this environment? What's going on?
Yeah, I mean, I'll keep it pretty simple. I wholeheartedly agree with Matt. I think that aligns a lot with what I've seen in my experience. I think I've had a project as short as kind of like, you know, 3 to 4 months, and they were able to just, but that's an outlier. I think 8 months is kind of the average year, right? And I'm counting that from sort of starting initial site selection. Matt, I loved your phrase, sort of concept to keys, like starting that concept, initial site selection to announcement, right? And your incentive package and your lease or your purchase has been negotiated. So it doesn't take into effect staffing, and getting energized potentially. It's outside of that. But yeah, 8 months to a year, I think is probably a good benchmark to build in.
Okay, Teresa, what's you agree with that? Have a different experience? What's your take?
I'm very similar. If companies are coming in and they've got a contract that they have got to meet and fulfill, they're going to come in with that really fast timeline. And, we have seen 4 months, kind of project from start to finish. Other times it can take longer, and hopefully we all like to have that extended period so we're not kind of rushed and we can really dig in with the company and make sure we understand their needs, and make sure we share what's really going to make the difference for them. I think we're seeing now some of these when these hopefully these companies, I think, are coming in with a consultant, or they've with a real estate expert where they're doing we may see it and it's 8 months or so, but hopefully they've done a lot of work on the front end, having those conversations, understanding what are the must-haves, what they would like. And so when they get to us, they've honed that business plan and really what they need to make the process move forward quickly. So, that's where we really count on the consultants to, I can't tell you what's going to be best for your business. You need to come to me and tell me what you need, and I'll help you find it in South Carolina. But yeah, you need to kind of be having these conversations on the front end before you actually get to us. Once you get to us, we can help you speed through the process if you know really what you're looking for. And I say again, good real estate consultants, good site selection consultants can really help their clients move through this process in a way that if you don't do it. The other things we're seeing projects that are employing new technologies, new plant layouts, new things. And so sometimes we're building the plane as we're trying to land it. And so that's another trend that has definitely come in the last few years as we're looking at, these different new technologies, new industries coming into, to focus. So that's something to think about as well. They come to us, and they say, we think we need X amount of acres, but they can't give us a footprint for a building to see how it fits on a site because they don't necessarily know. And you've got people designing facilities as we're trying to find, places to put them. So that's another interesting, nuance to site selection these days. So, and I think everybody's probably experiencing some of that.
Okay. Well, look, we went a little over. I want to say thanks to our co-panelists, Will Butler, MJ Shao, Teresa Powers, Matt Jarrett. Thank you so much. Thank you all for attending. Thank you for your great questions. We tried to get to all of them. I know we didn't. For those where we didn't, we'll try and follow up with you individually. And here, as you can see, to the extent you'd like to get in touch with any of the panelists, we've got our contact information available. And again, we want to thank everybody for attending our webinar and wish everybody to have a wonderful day. Thank you again. Bye-bye.